Instructional or educational books generally fall into one of two categories. You've either got the 101, the basic, really good at introducing a subject. If someone has zero core knowledge, it's really, really good at giving them the language, giving them the things they need to be thinking about and understanding, but really boring and too basic for someone who has that core knowledge. So basic that someone reading it, it's just a waste of their time. Or you've got the advanced. It has all that language and it uses language that somebody needs to have that kind of base knowledge of. People who have no core knowledge won't be able to understand that book. The advanced methods are too far, but it's really good at getting those people who do have that core knowledge to grow. It challenges their mind and challenges their understanding to grow into an area that's more helpful with that knowledge. It's quite unique for a book to be able to do both. Have both that basic introduction and the advanced grow challenge. Mark has both. This week, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction to Mark, so that as you read through Mark and as you do your studies, you can start to look for those little unique things about Mark, the way that Mark works, the purpose of Mark, the focus of Mark, and what Mark might want us to get out of his gospel. And hopefully that helps you read it much better and get more out of it. If you're new and it's all new knowledge to you, then it should be easier for you to read, I'm hoping. But if you have that core understanding already, hopefully it allows you to grow, and it hopefully allows you to be more challenged by Mark in a way that you might not have been able to do before. Now, when we come to Mark's gospel, it's an interesting one in that it's Mark's gospel. We don't hear about Mark in his gospel, in Matthew or in Luke. Mark, as we know from Acts and how Paul talks about him, is clearly younger than Paul. And so if he's around when Jesus is around, he's a real little kid. And I'm not sure that we'd trust a little kid's stories. But what we do know is that Mark is an interpreter to Peter. While Peter is in Rome, Mark is interpreting for him. Mark is letting people know what Peter is saying in Aramaic, in Greek or in Latin. It's highly likely, and it seems to be the case from the story and how it's told, and as you read you'll see it, that Mark is writing down what Peter is saying. Mark doesn't try to make it chronological, and we get from kind of early church sources that Peter wasn't too concerned with chronological order either. Mark's not like the other Gospels. It's just how Mark is. And it makes sense. It's probably written to the Roman church, and that makes a little bit of sense. And it's probably written, the earliest of all the Gospels, shortly before or after Peter's execution, which again, understandable. If you know the person who's the source of your material is about to die, start writing the stuff down. If you know that they have just died and you want to keep what they've been saying, you write it down. So that's probably Mark. Matthew and Luke actually use Mark as a source. I think something crazy like 91% of Mark is used in Matthew and Luke. So it's early, and it's a reliable source for others as well to understand the life of Jesus. Now, as I said, it's probably written to a Roman audience, and there's little things that kind of tell us that. For example, 1242 and 1516, Mark explains a Greek term with a Latin one. So people who understand Greek are all over the world at the moment, but those in Rome are a little bit stubborn in their ways and still speak Latin, and they're a little bit more ignorant of Greek terms. Mark explains them. Then there's Aramaic words that Mark actually translates, words or proper names that Mark translates for people. So 317, 541, 711, 734, 1046, 1436, 1522, and 1534 are all times where there's an Aramaic word that Mark then translates. So he'll say, whatever the word is, this means this, or which means this. He does that quite a bit. Only people who don't understand Aramaic need that. He also explains a Jewish custom in 7:3-4. So washing of cups and stuff like that, where those in Rome would have no understanding, and those in Judea and Jerusalem would understand it. You don't need to explain it. So it's actually a really good gospel for us because Mark is writing to a group of people who don't understand Jewish customs. So he kind of does a little bit of explaining for those people. We then need to do that work of trying to figure out his translations and if he translates into the Latin, what that Latin is. But a lot of the work of cross-culture work has been done for us a little bit by Mark already. So that brings us to Mark's purpose. Why does Mark write? If he's writing down what Peter said, and he's writing to predominantly Romans, probably, why does Mark write? Now, there seems to be an overall theme in Mark. I'm hoping that you'll see it as you read through. And that is that the shape of discipleship, so what a disciple looks like, how it kind of, the square hole that a disciple's got to fit through, its pattern is of the rejected and executed Messiah. That seems to be the big purpose of Mark, that if we're to be disciples, people who want to be disciples, what that's going to look like is like Jesus' life, a rejected and executed Messiah. Suffering and persecution is going to be part and parcel. Now, when we come to our Bibles, obviously there's translation, and often we have to pick a word. English is a little bit more regimented and a lot less flexible and a lot less helpful sometimes. But there are times when someone who's writing will use a word that could mean a particular word or another particular word. An easy one is psuche, means life or soul or both. And often, actually, when a writer uses a word that can have more than one meaning, there's a good chance they mean that it can have more than one meaning. There's often words they could have used that are specific, and they haven't. So with Mark, there's this overarching purpose, but what's that for? You know, when I preach, I might have an overarching purpose, but I want 5 different types of people to get something different out of it, and Mark is the same. Mark might be comforting those who are suffering. If Mark says the shape of discipleship, what discipleship looks like, is living like Jesus lived and being rejected and potentially executed, then that's a comfort to those who are suffering. No, I'm being a disciple. This is what it's going to be like. Perhaps Mark is writing to challenge people to witness to Jesus even though there might be suffering involved. So for those who go, oh, well, I don't want to witness to Jesus right now because I might suffer under Nero as a result of that, Mark is writing and saying, well, yes, that's what Jesus went through, and it'll be the same for you. Perhaps he's writing to challenge people's understanding of Jesus. That seems to be in there as well. And maybe, just maybe, he might be correcting an untrue belief of Jesus. And that'll make sense as I go through the rest of the introduction. And as you read, the untrue understanding of Jesus as just another magician, just a miracle worker, or just a wise sayings type person. There's a structure that helps us understand that. So the structure of Mark, there's different models. Some would say that it's Galilee and then Jerusalem, and you'll see that. There is a topographical shift. There's one place and then another place. That seems to be Mark. But really there's themes around Mark and discipleship that tell us a little bit about the structure. Chapter 1 to 8:21, Jesus is cruising around in Galilee, yes, but there's this growing awareness. It's making more sense of who Jesus is, but they're not entirely sure. There's an attraction to him, and Jesus' anointing is kind of obvious, but in what way? How full is it? And people are following him, but they don't get the full picture. They don't understand who Jesus really is. Then 8:22 to 10:52 is this kind of middle pivot. It goes from kind of general ministry and life, and it seems like Jesus, quite quickly, but Jesus is just cruising around, to a more directional, a more focused march towards the cross. And there's 3 passion predictions. Now, the passion, or anytime passion is used with Jesus, it's kind of death, burial, resurrection, ascension, that kind of all that stuff pulled in together. Jesus says why he's here. So early on, there's kind of a little bit of uncertainty. In this section, the 8:22 to 10:52, Jesus says 3 times why he's on earth, very clearly. There's some teaching on discipleship. So again, that's why people link, well, Mark wants us to get discipleship. Some teaching on discipleship. And then an inclusio. Now, an inclusio is just a word for a bracket that kind of reaffirms previously taught things or previously said things. And writers back then used it as a kind of sum up that's the segment concluded and we move on. So that's kind of where we figure there's that middle pivot. It's concluding the previous ministry, the previous kind of first third of Mark, and getting people ready for the next. And that next is 11:1 to 16:8. And that's the unfolding of Jesus' messiahship. There's the triumphal entry, which is misunderstood, but it is this unfolding, the clarity about who Jesus is becomes clearer and clearer, and what Jesus is going to do becomes clearer and clearer, until finally, at the cross, it's the centurion who finally sees Jesus' full identity with complete clarity. There's no changing, there's no anything. It's once the cross happens, that's when clarity happens. Now, there's a little bit of style to Mark. Mark writes a particular way. It's fast. It is frenetic. You won't get it too much in the English. You'll see kind of some words the same, but it's too much for English readers. Like, we would find it really hard. And it is, and immediately is a repeated phrase. And immediately Jesus goes here. And immediately Jesus went there. And immediately they went there. And immediately. And it's just every time there's a new little section, a new little episode, Mark begins it with and immediately. It's fast-paced. I read Matthew Riley books and I enjoy them because they're fast. I'll get the book on Christmas, and if I start reading it Christmas Day, I'll have finished it before Boxing Day is done. They're big books, but they're fast. They're easy to read lots of, and Mark is like that. It's also told in Greek, lose a little bit of it in English, but we still have the sense in English. We have actually done pretty well. It would be really hard to read the way it's written in Greek because it's all present tense. So Jesus is going somewhere. It hasn't gone. Jesus hasn't gone somewhere, or it's not that they went somewhere. No, they're going. It's all happening right now. And the way that works is that brings us into the story. That puts us in as a bystander. We're not one of the disciples because we're seeing what they're doing, and we're not Jesus, but we're a fly on the wall. Mark's gospel takes us right alongside what Jesus is doing, how Jesus is living. We're there watching it all happen right in front of us. That's how Mark writes. So, for us reading, for anyone hearing, we're brought into the life and ministry of Jesus. That's Mark's style. Very different to Matthew, very different to Luke, very different to John. But that style helps us pick things up. So hopefully you see that as you read. It's also secretive. You'll notice this as you read. Whenever Jesus' identity is perceived correctly by someone, up till 9:9, any time up to that point where Jesus' identity is perceived, it's tell no one. Don't tell anyone what you know. There's a secrecy around Jesus' identity, and a lot of that's to do with the misunderstanding that'll happen. And there's one time that it's not, and that's Mark 5:1-20. And I'll let you talk about that in your groups when you get to it. But there's a good reason why the man who's healed and all the demons are sent out of him, why he can tell people, why he can go spreading the good news about Jesus. And I'll leave that to your study guides. But other than that, everyone else who's in Galilee, in the area, and anywhere that would be waiting for the Messiah, tell no one. That's what they're told to do. And then finally, as I said, there's the clarity right at the end. Clarity only with the cross. You can't understand Jesus, Mark says. You can't understand Jesus without the passion. You can't understand who Jesus is without the cross. Because there's this correction of misunderstandings about who Jesus is. He's not the military leader that was expected. No, he's the dying Messiah that should have been expected. That's kind of Mark's style. Now, there's some things to look out for in Mark. I know you're getting a bit of information. I'm cramming all of this in as quick as I can. There's some things to look out for. It's full of irony. People doing things that you wouldn't expect them to, and people doing things that they're actually told not to do, ironically. So Jesus goes and tells people, tell no one. But you will read time and time again, they went and told everyone. They went and told their friends and family. That's constant. It is tell no one. And they go and tell everyone. And then right at the end of Mark, we have the angels tell the women, go and tell everyone. And then 16:8, we have, which right at the end, they said nothing to no one because they were afraid, which I actually quite like. We read it, I checked my translation, it's a little bit more boring. It's proper English, whereas in Greek it is say nothing to no one. It is that they said nothing to no one, that really ochre kind of type language. That's Mark. It's ironic. The one time they were told to tell, they don't. It focuses on servanthood. So look for irony. Look for servanthood. the glory of God coming in suffering and the cross and serving. That's really big in Mark. Again, how we get the discipleship stuff. There's miracles, yes, but Mark time and time again makes it very clear the miracles alone are not enough to understand Jesus. So again, there's that misunderstanding that we think Mark is trying to correct, that Jesus is just another miracle worker or just another magician. And Mark is clearly saying, no, the miracles alone aren't enough to understand Jesus because he's more than a miracle worker. He's more than a magician. And there's not much teaching. As you read Mark, you'll notice there's not that much where Jesus sits down and just teaches. There's teaching involved and we can learn things off Jesus' life, but it's not like Matthew and Luke, where there's this massive chunk of teaching. It just doesn't happen that way. And most likely it's because the sayings of Jesus are around. There were the sayings of Plato and the sayings of Socrates and things like that. And so there is that magician kind of miracle worker Jesus, and that's all he is. But then there's also the wise sayings Jesus, and Jesus says some wise things, and that's not uncommon to us, is it? That's how people talk about Jesus now. Oh yeah, he was a good bloke, but not God. Calm down. That's the same as what it was in Rome. And Mark says, no, I'm not going to deal with the sayings because you know the sayings of Jesus, but you don't know Jesus. And so instead, Mark gives us Jesus. It follows Jesus' life and actions. And that brings us back to discipleship, doesn't it? Now, just as I finish, this is the introduction to Mark. But in the introduction to Mark, I want to talk a little bit about the ending. The original ending is unlikely to be 16:8. When you read it through Mark and you get to 16:8, you'll see that the next little bit is got lines or brackets around it. 16:8 probably isn't the original ending. It's incomplete, and irony does fit well within Mark, but it's really, really odd in that culture and in the time to end a book like that. There's no book ever ending with a particular conjunction that Mark ends with in that time. It just doesn't happen. People end letters and things like that with it, but no big book like that is ever ended with that conjunction. It's also a weird ending because there's no closure. And we're not waiting for a sequel. Mark wasn't writing a sequel. We watch a movie and it ends with this big cliffhanger. That's not how they worked. Luke, for example, Luke 24:50-53, if you read that, it's an ending. That ends the Gospel of Luke. It concludes it. We could finish with Luke and be quite happy. But we actually have a sequel, and that's Acts. So even with a sequel, and even though Luke wrote one, we've got an ending. A lot of our early manuscripts end at 16:8. It's very likely that we've not found them, at least, but very likely that we've just lost the original ending of Mark. We just don't have it. We may find it, but we haven't yet. But we also know that the long ending, 9-20, also isn't original. When you read Mark, you'll feel that too. It just doesn't sound like Mark. And it doesn't sound like Mark because the language is different and the grammar is different. People who are very good at looking at Greek grammar and all the rest of it have looked at it, and it's just not Mark. We know it's not Mark. It doesn't sound like Mark. That's not the end of the world. Likely a scribe knows that there's more. There's probably a bunch of people who knew that there was more to Mark that's not in this manuscript, and so have either tried to remember it and write it down, or what we think has gone, there was an ending and we don't have it now. I don't know what it was, and you can't end like this. And so it seems they've grabbed bits from Matthew and Hebrews and Acts, which is why we get they're going to be holding snakes and being bitten, because that happens. Paul and Silas are shipwrecked and snakes bite the sailors and they're prayed for and they're healed. And that kind of, in a nutshell, is in Mark. Like, it's this weird kind of smashing together of things, and it's really just an abrupt end. If you read the book of Mark and then read 9-20, it's just like quickly wrap everything up and finish. That's kind of how it feels. Now, there's nothing really bad in it, and there's nothing massively life-changingly helpful in it either. It's there, and we can read it, and read it as part of Mark, understand that. But what would be helpful when you read it all, when you're in the studies, think about what the ending at Mark 16:8 would do for us. If we end at Mark 16:8, Jesus is risen and he's out there. He's doing stuff, he's active, he's alive and out there and going. If we end at 16:8, there is the irony and there is that challenge. It really does enforce that challenge that the women were told, go and tell, and they said nothing to no one. So are you going to tell? Even in the face of persecution, are you going to tell? Are you going to go out and tell people? There is that kind of challenge in there, which sits well with the cost of discipleship. Ultimately, it's not something to get overly worked up at. So when you get to that bit, don't get overly worked up about it. It's not worth it. We have enough in our Bibles, we have enough in Mark to know Jesus, whether we find the actual ending or whether we use the longer ending, whether we don't use the longer ending, doesn't actually change how we can follow Jesus. Mark gives all of that already in his gospel. God bless.